Section 16 of Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 6, by Agnes and Elisabeth Strickland. This recording is in the public domain. Elisabeth, Chapter 5, Part 2. The report that her former suitor, the Archduke Charles, was in treaty for the hand of the Queen of Scots, filled Elizabeth's mind with jealous displeasure, for of all the princes of Europe, he was esteemed the most honourable and chivalric, and Elizabeth's rejection of his suit appears to have been only for the purpose of obtaining concessions on the subject of his religion more consistent with her own profession. She made very earnest remonstrances to the Queen of Scots on the unsuitableness of this alliance, and Cecil at the same time wrote to Munt, one of the pensionaries in Germany, to move the Duke of Württemberg to advise the Emperor to repeat the offer of his son to the Queen of England. The Duke performed his part with all due regard to the honour of her maiden majesty, for he sent an envoy to entreat her to permit him to name a person whom he considered would make her very happy in the wedded state, at the same time that he preferred his private mission to the Emperor. Elisabeth replied, with her usual prudery on the subject of marriage, that although she felt no inclination towards matrimony, she was willing, for the good of her realm, to receive the communication of which the Duke had spoken. Unfortunately, however, the Emperor had taken umbrage at the previous rejection of his son's addresses, and declared, "he would not expose himself to a second insult of the kind." When Elizabeth found she could not withdraw the Archduke from Mary, she determined to compel Mary to resign him. Accordingly, she gave that queen to understand that she could not consent to her contracting such a marriage, which must prove inimical to the friendship between the two crowns, and that, unless Mary would marry as she desired, she would probably forfeit all hope of a peaceful succession to the English crown. Mary had the complaisance to give up this accomplished prince, who was, perhaps, the only man in Europe worthy of becoming her husband, and professed her willingness to listen to the advice of her good sister, if she wished to propose a more suitable consort. Randolph, Elizabeth's ambassador, suggested that an English noble would be more agreeable to his royal mistress than any other person. Mary requested to be informed more clearly on this point, for it was generally supposed that the young Duke of Norfolk, being the kinsman of the Queen, and one of the richest subjects in England, was the person intended for this signal honour by his sovereign. Elizabeth electrified both courts by naming her own favourite, Lord Robert Dudley. Mary replied, that she considered it beneath her dignity to marry a subject, and told her base brother, Murray, who repeated her unlucky witticism to the English ambassador, that she looked on the offer of a person so dear to Elizabeth as a proof of good will rather than of good meaning. Elizabeth, soon after, complained that Mary had treated the proposal of Lord Robert Dudley with mockery, which Mary, in a letter to her own ambassador at Paris, affirms that she never did, and wondered "who could have borne such testimony to embroil her with that queen." If, however, Mary forbore from mockery at this offer, no one else did, for it was a theme of public mirth and satire in England, Scotland, and France. Dudley, who had the presumption to aim at a still higher mark, and had been encouraged, by the extraordinary tokens of favour lavished upon him by his royal mistress, to conceive confident hopes of success, was surprised and offended at his own nomination to an honour so infinitely above the rank and pretensions of any person of his name and family. In fact, he regarded it as a snare laid in his path by Cecil, who was jealous of his influence with Elizabeth, and would, he suspected, avail himself of this pretence to remove him from her court and presence. Elizabeth was flattered at Dudley's reluctance to wed her fairer rival, and redoubled her commendations of his various qualifications to the favour of a royal lady. She even offered to acknowledge Mary as her successor to the crown of England, on condition of her becoming his wife. The hope of obtaining this recognition was artfully held out to Mary, as the lure to draw her into the negotiation, and so far it succeeded, although the royal beauty was not sufficiently an adept in diplomatic trickery to conceal at all times the scorn with which she regarded a suitor so infinitely beneath her. Meantime she was secretly courted by her aunt, Lady Lennox, for the young Henry, Lord Darnley, and was believed to incline towards that alliance. At the very time Elisabeth was recommending her handsome master of the horse to her good sister of Scotland, she had so little command over herself that she was constantly betraying her own partiality for him to Sir James Melville, Mary's envoy, who, in his lively, historic memoirs, gives a succession of graphic scenes between Elisabeth and himself. "She told me," says his Excellency, "that it appeared to her as if I made but small account of Lord Robert, seeing that I named the Earl of Bedford before him, but ere it were long she would make him a greater earl, and I should see it done before me, for she esteemed him as one whom she should have married herself, if she had ever been minded to take a husband. But being determined to end her life in virginity, she wished the queen her sister should marry him, for with him she might find it in her heart to declare Queen Mary's second person rather than any other. For, being matched with him, it would best remove out of her mind all fear and suspicion of usurpation before her death." Elisabeth would not permit Sir James Melville to return home till he had seen Dudley created Earl of Leicester and Baron of Denbigh. This was done with great state at Westminster, herself, says Melville, helping to put on his robes, he sitting on his knees before her, and keeping a great gravity and discreet behaviour. But as for the queen, she could not refrain from putting her hand on his neck to tickle him smilingly, the French ambassador and I standing beside her. Then she asked me, how I liked him? I said, as he was a worthy subject, so he was happy in a great prince, who could discern and reward good service. Yet, replied she, ye like better of yon lang lad, pointing towards my lord Darnley, who, as nearest prince of the blood, that day bare the sword before her. My answer again was, that no woman of spirit would make choice of sic a man, that was liker a woman than a man, for he was lusty, beardless, and lady-faced. I had no will that she should think I liked him, though I had a secret charge to deal with his mother, Lady Lennox, to purchase leave for him to pass to Scotland. During the 9 days I remained at court, pursues Melville, Queen Elizabeth saw me every day, and sometimes thrice a day, to wit, a forenoon, afternoon, and after supper, and she continued to treat of Queen Mary's marriage with Leicester, and meantime I was familiarly and favourably used. Sometimes she would say, that since she could not see the good queen her sister, she should open a good part of her inward mind to me, that she was not offended with Queen Mary's angry letter, in which she seemed to disdain the marriage with Leicester, and she should set the best lawyers in England to search out who had the best right to the crown of England, which she would wish to be her dearest sister rather than any other. I replied, there could be no doubt on that head, but lamented that even the wisest princes did not take sufficient notice of the partialities of their familiar friends and counsellors, except it were sic a notable and rare prince as Henry VIII, her father, who, of his own head, was determined to declare his sister's son, James V, at which time Elisabeth was not born, but only her sister Queen Mary, heir apparent to the crown of England, failing the heirs of his own body, for the earnest desire he had to unite the whole island. She said, she was glad he did not. I said, he had but then a daughter, and was in doubt to have any more children, and as yet had not so many suspicions in his head, and added, that her majesty was out of all doubt regarding her children, being determined to die a virgin. She said, she was never minded to marry, except she were compelled by the queen her sister's hard behaviour to her. I said, madam, ye need not tell me that. I know your stately stomach. Ye think, gin ye were married, ye would be but queen of England, and now ye are king and queen baith, ye may not suffer a commander. She appeared to be so affectionate to Queen Mary, her good sister, that she had a great desire to see her, and because that could not be, she delighted oft to look on her picture. She took me to her bedchamber, and opened a little lettrone, perhaps a desk, where there were divers little pictures wrapped in paper, their names written with her own hand. Upon the first she took up was written, my lord's picture. This was Leicester's portrait. I held the candle, and pressed to see my lord's picture. Albeit she was loath to let me see it, but I became importunate for it, to carry home to my queen. She refused, saying, she had but one of his. I replied, she had the original. She was then at the further end of her bedchamber, talking with Cecil. Elizabeth then took out my queen's of Scots miniature, and kissed it. Melville kissed her hand in acknowledgment of the great fondness she manifested towards Mary. She showed me, he continues, a fair ruby great like a racquet ball. I desired she should either send it to my queen, or the Earl of Leicester's picture. She replied, if Queen Mary would follow her counsel, she would get them both in time, and all she had, but she would send her a diamond as a token by me. Now, as it was late, after supper she appointed me to be with her the next morning, at 8, at which time was her hour for walking in the garden. She talked with me of my travels, and invited me to eat with her dame of honour, my lady Stafford, one honourable and godly lady, who had been banished to Geneva in the reign of Queen Mary of England. In the course of Melville's conferences with Queen Elizabeth, the female costume of different countries was discussed, and how they became the persons of women. She told him she had the weeds, or costume, of every civilized country, and gave proof of it by appearing in a fresh one every day, and asking the Scotch ambassador which was the most becoming. I said, the Italian weed, continues Melville, which pleased her well, for she delighted to show her golden-coloured hair by wearing a caul and bonnet, as they do in Italy. Her hair was redder than yellow, and curled apparently by nature. Then she inquired, what coloured hair was reputed best, and whether my queen's hair or hers was the best, and which of the two was the fairest? Melville's answer was perplexing in its ambiguity. He said, the fairness of both was not their worst faults. Elizabeth was not to be baffled by an oracular compliment. She came again to the question direct, and was earnest for Melville to declare which of them both he thought the fairest. Melville answered, you are the fairest queen in England, and ours the fairest queen in Scotland. Yet, he continues, was she earnest. The poor ambassador then declared, they were both the fairest ladies in their courts, that she was the whitest, but that our queen was very lovely. She inquired, which of them was the highest stature? I answered, our queen. Then she is over high, returned Elizabeth, for I am neither too high nor too low. Then she asked how she, Queen Mary, exercised and employed her time. I answered, when I left Scotland on my embassy, our queen was newly come from the Highland hunting, but that when she had leisure, she read in good books the histories of divers countries, and would sometimes play on the lutes and virginals. Elizabeth, continues Melville, speered or asked whether Mary played well. Reasonably well for a queen, was the very discreet answer. This conversation occasioned a droll little scene of display and vanity to be got up by Elizabeth. The same day after dinner, Lord Hunsdon, Elizabeth's cousin, drew Melville into a retired gallery to hear some music. He whispered as a secret, that it was the queen playing on the virginals. The ambassador listened a while, and then withdrew the tapestry that hung before the doorway, boldly entered the room, and stood listening in an entranced attitude near the door, and heard her play excellently well. Her back was to the listener. At length she turned her head, affected to see him, and left off, coming forwards as if to strike him with her hand, as pretending to be ashamed, alleging, that she was not used to play before men, but when she was solitary, to eschew melancholy, and asked, how I came there? I replied, that I was walking with my Lord Hunsdon. As we passed by the chamber door, I heard sick melody, which raised and drew me into the chamber, I wist not how, excusing my fault of homeliness, as being brought up in the court of France, and that I was now willing to endure any punishment it would please her to lay on my offence. The expert flattery had its expected effect. The royal coquette sat herself down on a cushion to imbibe another dose of it, and the audacious flatterer placed himself on his knee beside her. She gave him, with her own hand, a cushion to place under his knee. Melville protested against such an innovation on the rules of gallantry, but the queen compelled him, and called in my lady Stafford out of the next chamber to chaperone the conference, for hitherto she had been tête-à-tête with the Scotch ambassador. This arrangement having been happily made, her majesty proceeded to display the rest of her accomplishments. First, she demanded, whether she or the Queen of Scots played best? In that, says Melville, I gave her the praise. She said my French was good, and speered whether I could speak Italian, which she spake reasonably well. Then she spake to me in Dutch, but it was not good. She would know what kind of books I liked best, whether theology, history, or love matters. I said, I liked weel of all the sorts. I was earnest to be dispatched, but she said, that I tired sooner of her company than she did of mine. I said, albeit there was no occasion to tire, yet it was time to return. But 2 days longer was I detained, that I might see her dance. Quilk being done, she inquired at me, whether she or my queen danced best? I said, my queen danced not so high or disposedly as she did. Whereby it may be gathered that Mary danced like an elegant woman, but surely the elaborate dancing of a vain affected person could scarcely be better defined than by Melville. Elizabeth wished that she might see the Queen of Scotland at some convenient place of meeting. I offered, pursues Melville, to convey her secretly to Scotland by post, clothed in the disguise of a page, that she might see our mistress, as King James V passed in disguise to France, to see the Duke of Vendôme's sister, that should have been his wife. Melville carried on this romantic badinage by proposing that Queen Elizabeth should give out that she was sick and kept her chamber, and none to be privy to her absence but my Lady Stafford and one of the grooms of her chamber. She said, alas, she might do it, and seemed to like well of that kind of language. This scene took place at Hampton Court, where Melville at last received his dismissal and departed with Leicester by water to London. On their voyage, Leicester apologized for his presumptuous proposal for the hand of the Queen of Scots, for he assured her ambassador, apparently with sincerity enough, was a wily move of Mr. Secretary Cecil, designed to ruin him with both queens. Elizabeth appears to have pressed this marriage on her royal kinswoman of Scotland, without any real intention of resigning her favourite to that queen, but rather for the purpose, it has been supposed, of paving the way of her own marriage with him by proving that she esteemed him worthy of being the consort of another female sovereign. If Mary could have been induced to signify her consent to accept Leicester for her husband, then probably it was intended for him to declare the impossibility of his resigning the service of his royal mistress, even to become the spouse of the Queen of Scots, and this would have afforded Elizabeth a real popular opportunity of rewarding him for the sacrifice with her own hand. Matters never reached this point, for when Mary was urged to accept the newly created English earl, the Queen Mother of France and her kinsman of the House of Guise expressed the utmost contempt at the idea of so unsuitable an alliance, and assured her that Elizabeth intended to marry him herself. This opinion must have had some weight when united with Melville's report of the indecorous manner in which the English queen had committed herself in toying with Leicester during the ceremonial of his investiture, unrestrained even by the presence of the foreign ambassadors. Meantime, peace having been established with France, a regal suitor was offered to Elizabeth's acceptance in the person of Charles IX, the youthful monarch of that realm, who had been recently declared by the states of France to have attained his majority, although his mother, Catherine de Medicis, continued to govern in his name. He was, at this time, about 16, and Elizabeth, with great propriety, replied to Michel Castelnau, the ambassador by whom the proposal was submitted to her, that she was greatly obliged for the signal honour that was done her by so mighty and powerful a king, to whom, as well as to the queen his mother, she professed herself infinitely beholden, but that she felt this difficulty, that the most Christian king, her good brother, was too great and too small, too great as a monarch of such a realm to be able to quit his own dominions to cross the sea and remain in England, where the people always expected their kings and queens to live. Too small, she explained by saying, that his majesty was young and she was already 30, which she called old. Castelnau, not being accustomed to Elizabeth's coquettish manners, far from suspecting that this depreciatory remark on her own age was a trap for a complimentary rejoinder, on his part, gave her credit for meaning what she said, and adds with great simplicity, She has said the same thing ever since her accession to the throne, although there is not a lady in her court who surpasses her in her endowments of mind and body. The English nobles suggested to Castelnau that the young Duke of Anjou, Charles IX's brother, would be, in point of situation, a more suitable consort for the queen than Charles, as neither France nor England could permit the absence of their respective sovereigns. The French, they said, would not like their king to reside in England, nor would the English permit their queen to live in France. Elizabeth gave no encouragement, at that time, to overtures for her union with either of the royal brothers of Valois, and Castelnau proceeded to Scotland to offer the younger prince to the other island queen, Mary Stuart, of whom he speaks, in his dispatches to his own court, in the most lively terms of admiration and respect. A matrimonial union between the crowns of England and France was too brilliant a chimera to be hastily or lightly abandoned by that restless intrigante and shallow politician, Catherine de Medicis, and she subsequently empowered the resident French ambassador, de Foix, to renew the proposal of a marriage between her eldest son, the youthful sovereign of France, and the maiden monarch of England. To this second overture Elizabeth replied: I find myself, on the one hand, much honoured by the proposal of the French king; on the other, I am older than he, and would rather die than see myself despised and neglected. My subjects, I am assured, would oppose no obstacle, if it were my wish, for they have more than once prayed me to marry after my own inclination. It is true they have said, that it would pleasure them if my choice should fall on an Englishman. In England, however, there is no one disposable in marriage but the Earl of Arundel, and he is further removed from the match than the East from the West, and as to the Earl of Leicester, I have always loved his virtues. The ambassador was too finished a courtier, it seems, to interrupt her majesty by asking her to point these out, a question which certainly would embarrass the most partial apologist of the crimes of this bold, but not brave, bad man. But, pursues Elizabeth, the aspirations towards honour and greatness which are in me, cannot suffer him as a companion and a husband. After this confidential explanation of her feelings towards the two rival earls, her subjects, her majesty, in allusion to the extreme youthfulness of her regal wooer, added, laughing, My neighbour, Mary Stuart, is younger than I am. She will, perhaps, better please the king. This has never been spoken of, replied de Foix, she having been the wife of his brother. Several persons, rejoined Elizabeth, and among others Lethington, have tried to persuade me that such a plan was in agitation, but I did not believe it. A few days after, Elizabeth sent for de Foix again, and repeated her objections to the marriage with his boy king. De Foix endeavoured to convince her they were of no weight, but, after a little courtly flattery had been expended, the negotiation was broken off. This summer Elizabeth honoured Leicester with her first visit to his new manor of Kenilworth, in the course of her progress through the Midland counties. When she entered the city of Coventry, the mayor and corporation who had met and welcomed her, presented her with a purse supposed to be worth 20 marks, containing £100 in gold angels. The queen, on receiving it, said to her lords, It is a good gift. I have but few such, for it is £100 in gold. The mayor boldly rejoined, If it like your grace, it is a great deal more. What is that? asked the queen. The mayor answered, It is the faithful hearts of all your true loving subjects. We thank you, Mr. Mayor, said the queen, that it is a great deal more indeed. She invited the mayor and corporation to visit her at Kenilworth on the following Tuesday, which they did, and were admitted to kiss her hand. She gave them $30 and knighted the recorder. If Elizabeth at this period were not in love with Leicester, the proverb which affirms that of the fullness of the heart the mouth speaketh must go for naught, for she was always talking of him, and not only to those sympathizing listeners, her ladies of the bedchamber, but to such unsuitable confidants as the ambassadors, ergo accredited spies of foreign potentates. Well might the wily son of Burleigh observe of this queen, that if today she were more than man, tomorrow she would be less than woman. De Foix's reports appear to have convinced his own court that it was Elizabeth's positive intention to give her hand to Leicester, for Catherine de Medicis enjoined him to cultivate the goodwill of this favoured peer, and entitle the royal family of France to his gratitude, by advocating the match with the queen of England. I told Queen Elizabeth, writes de Foix, in reply to the queen mother, that she could do nothing better for the welfare, repose, and content of her kingdom, than to espouse one of the great peers of England, and that she would put an affront upon the king and your majesty, if she were to wed any other foreign prince, after having finally grounded her rejection of the king, on the plea that a stranger would be unwelcome to the English. Elizabeth replied, that she was not yet decided whom to marry, observing, that even if she espoused a person without extensive possessions, his marriage with her would give him the means of engaging in pernicious schemes and intrigues. For this reason, continued she, I will never concede to a husband any share in my power, and added, that but for the sake of posterity and the good of her realm, she would not marry at all. If she did, however, she did not mean to follow his advice by wedding a subject. She had it in her power to wed a king if she pleased, or a powerful prince, so as to overawe France. This was in allusion to the Archduke Charles, who, having been decisively rejected by Mary of Scotland, was renewing his suit to her; while she complained that Charles IX took part with the Queen of Scots, while Darnley was writing her submissive letters and seeking her protection. This reproachful observation proves that Elizabeth and Darnley were already secretly reconciled. She had vehemently opposed his marriage with Mary Stuart, and yet had permitted him to visit the court of that queen. The hitherto impregnable heart of the beautiful widow had surrendered itself at first sight of the beardless lady-faced boy, and Darnley paid no heed to the peremptory mandates of his sometime English sovereign to return at peril of outlawry and forfeiture of his English inheritance. He kept the field of his new fortunes, and was a thriving wooer. De Foix, as soon as he heard the Queen of Scots had resolved on the marriage with her cousin Darnley, went to Elizabeth with the intention of defending Mary. He found the queen at chess, and said, profiting by the opportunity of introducing the subject, "This game is an image of the words and deeds of men. If, for example, we lose a pawn, it seems but a small matter; nevertheless, the loss often draws after it that of the whole game." The queen replied, "I understand you. Darnley is but a pawn, but may well checkmate me, if he is promoted." After these words she left off playing, complained much of the disloyalty of Darnley and his father, and made evident her intentions of dealing, if it were possible, hostilely by them. The only means she had, however, of testifying her anger effectively was by sending Margaret, Countess of Lennox, to her old quarters in the Tower. 2 out of the 4 royal ladies, who stood in immediate proximity to the throne, were now incarcerated on frivolous charges, and, on the 21st of August, a third of this luckless quartette, Lady Mary Grey, was added to the list of fair state prisoners, for no greater crime than stealing a love match, like her sister, Lady Catharine. Cecil, in a letter to Sir Thomas Smith, relates the circumstance in the following words: "Here is an unhappy chance and monstrous. The sergeant porter, being the biggest gentleman in his court, hath married secretly the Lady Mary Grey, the least of all the court. They are committed to several prisons. The offence is very great." Both the meek inoffensive sisters of Lady Jane Grey were thus torn from their husbands, and doomed to lifelong imprisonment by the inexorable queen. Their piteous appeals to her compassion may be seen in Ellis's royal letters. Can any one suppose that she would have scrupled to shed the blood of either or both of these broken-hearted victims, if their names had been used to excite an insurrection in her metropolis? In a foregoing passage of the letter, wherein Cecil relates the disgrace of Lady Mary Grey, he favours his absent colleague with the following important piece of secret information, which is partly written in cipher: "You may, perchance, by some private letter hereafter, hear of a strange accident here, and therefore I will, in a few words, give you some light. The queen's majesty is fallen into some misliking with my lord of Leicester, and he therewith much dismayed. You know how busy men in court will be to descant hereupon. The queen's majesty letteth appear, in many overt speeches, that she is sorry for her loss of time, and so is every good subject." In what other way can this sentence be explained than that Elisabeth, having quarrelled with her presumptuous favourite, repented of the impediment which her flirtations with him had opposed in her matrimonial treaties with foreign princes? What shall follow of this, pursues her anxious premier, God knoweth. For my part, I will do that becometh an honest man, not to procure harm to him, though I know he hath not lacked procurers for my harm. But God forgive them, for I fear none of them, having so good a conscience of my well meaning, both to her majesty and her realm. If I were as evil disposed as others, I could make a flame of this sparkle, but fiat voluntas Dei. The queen's majesty, thanked be God, is well disposed towards marriage. The emperor's ambassador is departed with an honourable answer, and himself well satisfied, and common opinion is, that the Archduke Charles will come, which if he do, and will accord with us in religion, and shall be allowable for his person to see her majesty, then, except God shall continue his displeasure against us, we shall see some success. In another letter to Smith, Cecil declares that the queen's majesty will marry with none without sight of his person, nor with any that shall dissent in religion, that the articles of marriage are to be much the same as in the treaty between Philip and Mary, and expresses his opinion that the archduke will come. He considers that the nobility approve of the match, and notices that my lord of Leicester hath behaved himself very wisely to allow of it. The very day on which this letter is dated, August 30th, the premier inscribed the following sentence in his private diary: "The queen seemed to be very much offended with the Earl of Leicester, and so she wrote an obscure sentence in a book at Windsor." This oracular sentence was probably her Latin epigram on the presumption of a bear presuming to cherish hopes of mating with the lion. Section 17.